Having such terrible thoughts, you'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. Is it just in the spread of case, coherent yet unknown name? Oh, can you put me in coach? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on your side means that I lied. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With. Thank you for taking this time out of your afternoon or wherever you are to join us for this live stream interview. We're really excited to get into the topic that we're going to be discussing with our guest today. So without further ado, I'm going to bring him in. One moment. Aaron Griffith, how's it going, man?
Hey, how you doing?
Doing pretty good. So for those of you who don't know Aaron, which I'm not sure many of our audience do know who you are, why don't you give them a kind of a little bit about who you are, what you do, and maybe a little bit about your sort of background as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me here. This is a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
So my name's Aaron Griffith. I am a professor of history at
Oh, I think you froze, Aaron. I don't know if you can hear me. Hopefully he'll come back on. That's a great frozen face too. We'll see if he connects back on. Thanks for those of you who are in the chat. This is going to be a great discussion, and I'm glad that y'all are here with us. Can you hear me? Oh, he dropped out. Hopefully he'll come back on. Hey, man.
I do not know what
dropped out for a second. No, you're fine. There was a great frozen shot on your face for a while too. That was very flattering. So just FYI, it was good. So the last thing that I heard, I don't know what anyone else heard, was you said that you're a professor of history.
Yeah,
at Sattler College.
That's all that really needs to be known.
Okay, great.
No, this is just story of my life during the Zoom zeitgeist that we're in, where you just have frozen faces and
happens all the time.
So
yeah,
it may happen again. We'll see.
That's okay. It might happen to me too. It does happen, and then you'll have to take over the show, and then you'll step in as the host. You can do whatever you want. Yeah.
I have like a stand-up routine ready. And,
yeah, dude. Good. Oh man, it may have happened again.
Sattler College. Hey, no?
I can hear you. You're frozen though.
All right. All right, cool. I'm going to start my browser to see if this comes back.
Sure, that's a good idea. There we go. Now we've got two of you in. There.
Sure. So I'm actually, so I'm currently in like rural Georgia right now.
Sure, gotcha.
This may be part of the issue, the internet speed here, but
yeah, you're fine. We'll do our best.
Okay, so maybe we'll skip what I was going to say since that seems to have. I teach history. I teach American history, religious history at Sattler, I'm very interested in my research in issues of religion and politics in the United States, history of evangelicalism, and criminal justice, mass incarceration issues. And I am excited to write and speak and think with others about issues relating to Christian involvement in criminal justice, whether supporting law and order, punitive movements, or resisting them, or living within prison. So, yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So before we kind of get into our topic for today, which is really about your brand new book, it came out a month ago. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
1 month ago. Yeah.
I wanted to kind of touch on something that's really kind of particularly relevant for those of you who are watching may know that yesterday Brandon Bernard was executed after the Supreme Court denied a request for a delay, and the Trump administration plans to sort of continue federal executions, and one of which is putting to death Alfred Bourgeois, which will potentially take place in an hour. It's a heavy day, I think, to do a stream on something like this, even though this is particularly sort of historical in its focus. And I know you don't have the expertise sort of in these specific cases that have been happening, but do you just have any sort of initial insights about what we can be doing, even if this is sort of in really small ways, small practical ways, in the days to come, that in terms of how we respond to this and what's been happening?
It's certainly been a heavy day, and this is a particularly frustrating day for me when I went back and just looked at some of the parts of my book and reading some of the stuff that I've, like some research I've done and some colleagues of mine that write on the death penalty, just to sort of reacquaint myself with maybe where we have come from. And I commend to you especially a scholar at Emory named Daniel LaChance, who writes on capital punishment and sort of its cultural history in America. And I think, like, what I'm struck by is just how this day feels very heavy, and this day feels very singular in some ways. And yet I hope we can all, like, remember that this is actually how it often is for so many who are caught up in the carceral state, whose whether the people that are executed by states, so these are federal executions that are happening, but state executions are still going on, or whose lives are just simply dominated by our criminal justice system in ways that dehumanize and that rob people of life in all sorts of ways. And what we have seen with the Brandon Bernard case, it seems to me, is just simply one more instance of this culture of death working itself out. And it's particularly galling because it just seems so obvious to me that that President Trump is vindictively letting this happen as a lame duck president, and it just seems to be so spiteful and unnecessary. But I think that's like a little bit of a rhetorical trap. I think we can go with that recognition, but we should realize that all deaths are unnecessary here. Like, this is not, we shouldn't just focus in on this because it's like Donald Trump being vindictive.
Yes, right.
We should remember how so many who are put to death or who are left to languish inside of prisons, how so much of that is unnecessary and is emblematic of just very troubling assumptions regarding the value of human life in our society. So it's hard. I mean, I hope that a case like this will continue to mobilize people to speak out, to speak to their elected, to write and call their elected representatives and to lobby. But it can't end, and it won't end with this particular instance. So,
yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you for kind of giving your insight on that. I know it would have been kind of bizarre to not mention that, given our short topic for today, right?
Yeah, sure.
But you've got this wonderful new book, God's Law and Order: The Politics of Punishment in Evangelical America, which was really, really awesome, man. Thank you so much for the work you put into that, and it's really an amazing work of history. Tell me a little bit about how you kind of got interested in this subject, really in the historical relationship between mass incarceration, the carceral system, and evangelicalism in particular. So
there's sort of like the boring academic answer, and then there's like the maybe more fun, maybe also boring, but maybe a little more interesting personal answer.
Pick whichever one you'd like.
I'll give both of them, and you can pick and choose. People can pick and choose which one they want. But the academic answer is that I was in my doctoral program and trying to think about what I was going to write my dissertation on. And I knew I was very interested in religious history and the history of American Christian influence in politics and public life. And I had grown especially interested in just the history of evangelicalism. And there have been so many amazing books in the last, several years written on the influence of evangelicals in American life, especially post-World War II. And I was just like eating all of this up, and I was just seeing just so many interesting things going on, evangelical influence on issues, in related to economics and capitalism, or abortion, or the communism. There were just so many different ways that evangelical history and American history were being narrated together, and that was exciting to me. But then I had started getting into, I read, like a lot of people, I read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and just sort of, I think it was assigned for a class, and started seeing this entire body of literature that also existed, long before even what Michelle Alexander wrote, but that was charting the expansion of prisons and the criminal justice system in the 20th century as well. And I started to think, like, what are these two historical realities, like evangelical influence in public life and the expansion of the criminal justice system, that are happening like at the same time? What do those two things have to do with one another? And I read, some great books by scholars like Winifred Sullivan and Tanya Erzan, who do more ethnographic work on like contemporary evangelical influence in prisons, and their stuff's amazing. But I really wanted to realize that there was like room to explore the historical dimensions of this, and to really try to figure out were there linkages, what what kinds of linkages there might be. So that's sort of the academic side of things. It's basically taking these two bodies of literature, scholarly literature, and putting them in conversation. And once I did that, I saw so many fruitful connections that emerged, and ways that I thought scholars of religious history can learn from scholars of the carceral state and vice versa. But the personal dimension of it, which was there long before that, was simply just being a part of Christian communities, whether churches or schools, and seeing the ways that life in those contexts intersected with the justice system, like regularly. Whether that was, people I knew who had been incarcerated and were like working out, that were Christians, and were like trying to work out what it meant to be a Christian inside of prison, or people that I knew who were involved in law enforcement and trying to like understand what their vocation was like as a Christian. Or, there were a few times when I was really lucky to get involved in prison ministry work. And I started doing prison ministry work when I was doing my master's. And initially it just started as something that a local church exposed me to. And I just was very interested in it and thought it was really fun and interesting and just enriching. But I then realized like there's a story here. Like why do we do ministry in this way? Why do we have certain assumptions? And where does this kind of work come from? And that all those questions were swirling in my mind as I was getting into my historical work. And I really, in the introduction of the book, I write about an experience of my own that was particularly important in this way. And that was when I was a college student at Wheaton College, which is an evangelical school. And there was a warden from Angola prison in Louisiana that came and spoke in our chapel. And he narrated a story in chapel of the execution of a man, and the warden overseeing this execution, and the warden praying with this man as he's executing him. And I remember, even as a college student, being so struck by this narration and the fact that like my college was sending mission teams of students, some of whom were my friends, like to Angola. And I was like, how not only is this evangelical fascination with issues of crime and punishment interesting, but this dual dimension of a quite literally compassionate concern and also killing someone at the same time. Like, how does those two realities work out together? So that was the personal side of it for me, that I'm pretty open about that animating this work as well. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, the way you narrate that story in the introduction of your book was really grabbed me. And I couldn't kind of put your book down. Like that was a brilliant way to sort of start off the book, I think, was to recount that experience and what was said. And I think one of the great things about your book, like all good history, is that it tells a story that isn't simple about whatever the subject matter is within history. And in this case, the historical relationship between evangelicalism and incarceration. For those who haven't read the book, who are watching this, how would you summarize sort of its main claims about, like you were talking about, the two kind of simultaneous things you saw in history that were happening at the same time with evangelicalism and the rise of mass incarceration? How would you talk about that?
So,
I think you're cutting out again. I heard a little bit of what you just said. We'll give it a second. Can you hear me? Nope, he dropped again. Give him a few minutes. Hopefully he'll be back on. So I put this in the chat, but as we go along, if those who are watching have any questions for Aaron as we get into the topic, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then I'll get to them at the end if there are any questions. But hopefully, you can get a bit more stable connection. He's got some really awesome stuff to say. So, yeah, I'm excited to kind of keep talking through this. But thanks, Metal Theologian. Appreciate that. And thanks, yeah. I don't know your name, Metal Theologian, but I've noticed you've been pretty active watching the stuff we've been putting out on Apocalypse here. You've had some really good comments too. So I'm glad you find the channel and the content we've been putting out interesting. And I hope you, keep engaging with us. I appreciate it. So what I'm going to do right now is put a link to Aaron's book in the chat for y'all, because it really is awesome. There you go. You're back. You were. Don't worry about it. I totally get the unstable internet.
Yeah. Okay. So this dual dimension of image of a prison warden who's a Christian. His name is Burl Cain, by the way, and he was recently named the head of the Mississippi Department of Corrections recently. So very influential guy. But the dual dimension that I narrate in the introduction of the book of this prison warden praying with an incarcerated man while he's executing him, I think captures a lot about what I'm doing in the book on a couple of levels. One is that when I started getting into the research, what I expected to find was sort of an aggressively punitive dimension to a lot of evangelical thinking and policymaking on criminal justice. And that's there. That's there. But what I found probably more often, though, than not, was evangelicals who were genuinely interested in having the criminal justice system reform and shape people's lives for the better and accomplish some humanitarian purpose through and seeing this as a part of their sort of Christian duty to do this. And I think that really sums up a lot of what Burl Cain, this prison warden, was up to. And it also sums up a lot of Christian influence within criminal justice in the 20th century. But it's a story of punitive outcomes, and it's a story of law and order. But often the way that law and order and those punitive outcomes were explained or characterized or framed by evangelicals or pursued was in service of what they saw as consensus-driven, compassionate. They use those kinds of justifications for what they're doing. So, for example, a good example of this is the ways that evangelicals talk about race. And so a lot of my book talks about sort of post-civil rights era evangelical, white evangelical activism. And the ways that evangelicals begin to talk about race in this time, they stress the neutrality and the colorblindness and even the humanitarian possibilities of policing for Black neighborhoods. And this is very much the public way that a lot of evangelicals begin to speak about policing as they're ramping up policing within these neighborhoods, as evangelicals themselves are increasingly involved in the work of policing. And I think this is like an important dimension to keep in mind, not only for understanding evangelicals and criminal justice, but also just the history of the carceral state in this country in general. The reason it seems to me that we have such an intractable problem with over-policing, mass incarceration, is in some ways because most Americans have bought into the idea that policing, imprisonment, confinement, surveillance are good things, which sounds just like very basic, like, and sounds maybe a little too simplistic, but I think it's that humanitarian impulse, or what Naomi Murakawa, who's a brilliant scholar, she calls this liberal impulse, this liberal history of mass incarceration. I think it's one that's worth taking seriously. So, for example, the good example that I often use today is like the current presidential climate. You know, we have Donald Trump, who's like a law and order, self-proclaimed law and order candidate, and mobilizes, you know, the specter of crime, and specifically crime within cities, for his own political ends. And it's easy to understand how that, I think, plays into our sort of problems of criminal justice in this country. And he's someone who's supported by white evangelicals, you know, tremendously. On the other hand, we have someone like Joe Biden, who for most of his career has also been a law and order candidate. And has, even in this last presidential election, has still maintained his general support for law enforcement and his own sense that this is a reformable issue. And I think that it's that sense of consensus and general agreement that characterizes the history of mass incarceration and the history of evangelical influence in that as well. Yeah,
great. One of the really interesting things that I think comes out of your work is how there seemed to be this sort of kind of shift in the 60s and 70s in the way evangelicals sort of understood the solution to social problems, especially crime. And as far as my understanding of your work, the shift seemed to be from kind of a conversionist solution to kind of allying more explicitly with punitive and violent powers of the state in the name of sort of protecting the social order. What are some historical reasons for that shift in your opinion, or in your sort of findings historically?
Yeah, so this was a part of, so what I narrate in the book here is an early post-World War II evangelical fascination with issues of crime and delinquency. So evangelicals are like people like Billy Graham, or David Wilkerson, who's this Pentecostal preacher in New York who goes on to become this very famous public presence. They are very concerned with issues of crime and delinquency, to the point that, you know, David Wilkerson writes this book called The Cross and the Switchblade, which sells like millions of copies, is made into a movie with Pat Boone. And it's pretty clear to me that part of the public appeal that's being made in these evangelists' careers is mobilizing this fear of crime. However, in the mid to late 40s to the early 60s, what I found in my research, though, was even though these evangelicals are talking a lot about crime and delinquency, sometimes in very I think over the top ways, they're not really talking about policing or law and order, or punitive solutions. In fact, it was very striking to me that so many of the evangelical ministries and evangelists that I covered were actually just focused on conversion. They would say things like, the solution to crime is just Jesus. Like, if we just give these, gang members Jesus, or we help them become Christians, they'll leave their life of crime. And it sounded very, at first glance, it sounded very simplistic and kind of, it just seemed like dismissible. And I think that that's probably why a lot of people then even dismissed it. But it was just very interesting to me that so many times these evangelists and evangelicals more generally they weren't talking about policing. They weren't talking about locking kids up or getting tough. That changes in the 60s.
Right.
And that's where I saw much more interest among evangelicals in the punitive solutions to crime. And I think that this happens in a couple of ways. One is just the broader cultural context is shifting. So the Warren Court is Earl Warren Supreme Court is a site of a lot of contestation at this time. And it's a site of contestation on religious questions. So can the Bible be read in public schools? Can prayer happen in public schools? Right. And the court rules in ways on those questions that really make evangelicals mad. But the court also starts to rule on criminal justice questions. So like Miranda v. Arizona, which gives suspects certain rights. You have the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney. And there are a whole host of other criminal procedure rulings that empower suspects in various ways, or grant them certain rights, or recognize their rights. And evangelicals sort of lump all this together and just see the Warren Court as this problem. And I think that to me is emblematic of the broader cultural shift that's happening. Is evangelicals are beginning to feel, as Christian Smith has put it, embattled. And they have to stake their claim against these secularizing or progressive forces, whether that's on religion, the public square, or on crime. And increasingly, if you're going to have a conservative position on crime, it's going to be punitive. But then secondly, this gets more to the question of race. We have a civil rights movement that is gaining steam in the 60s, and that is achieving, certain kinds of legal and policy outcomes that are desegregating public spaces, that are empowering voting rights, that are securing desegregated housing. And evangelicals in the midst of this, especially as protests against issues of police brutality in places and uprisings in places like Watts in Los Angeles, or Detroit, or Newark, evangelicals start to see these protests and uprisings as a problem to be contained, and to be contained with police power. And that is inevitably racial in character. It sets up this, and I really see that that's part of the pivot here as well. So the Warren Court, sort of broader struggle over the soul of America, as it were, and then this question of lingering civil rights protests and urban uprisings is really the shift that drives not only evangelicals, lots of Americans, but especially evangelicals, into more of this punitive law and order approach.
Right. Now, I think there's a common kind of perception of evangelicals simply sort of disliking big government, right? That seems to be sort of a common narrative about right-wing sort of evangelicals, right? But your work kind of shows that it's not that simple, right? Clearly, many people wanted more prisons and more government funding for law enforcement and all of that, right? Do you see this as a kind of tension within evangelicalism, or maybe something more like a flexibility? Like, how do you kind of make sense of this? Or do you just think the kind of common perception of evangelicals is just kind of, it misses the mark a bit.
Yeah.
Also,
I think
about this. I need to get my cat out of the office, so I'm gonna take my camera off.
Oh, is this Carl Bart? Is this Carl
Carl
Bart
Bart is actually in our bedroom because he still has his respiratory illness, so we're kind of keeping our cats separated at the moment. But he's doing well. He's starting to get bigger and stronger, and yeah. But thanks for asking.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Sure.
keep going. I'll be listening.
Okay. Yeah. So I think prisons and the carceral state in general introduce a problem into the ways we normally talk about political positions and various constituencies' orientation to matters of the state. So conservatives, in general, like when most of us are just sitting around talking about the sides of an issue, if you're a conservative, then you are for less governmental intervention, whether that's in the economy or in issues of school choice or something like that. If you're a liberal or a progressive, you are more for intervention from the state in these various ways. But of course, there's all kinds of issues that break this, that mess with this dichotomy, we could, talk about the various ways that this breaks down if you segment out conservative and liberal into various interest groups, or how it all depends on how you define issues of liberty or freedom even. So this is not just a question regarding the carceral state, but I think the carceral state introduces an interesting test case for how conservatives really are.
Right. That's a great
do
way
you
to put it.
you believe that the state should have this profoundly impactful ability to do all these different things to people, whether that's surveilling them, patting them down, stopping and frisking, from the policing side of things all the way into the sentencing and then into the imprisonment. The state is involved in all of this, and as a growing conservative revolution has occurred from this, the 60s on, the state has grown in this way. It has grown in its ability to do all of those things, to surveil, to police, to incarcerate. And I think this is where, it calls into question just how we analyze something like when people say they don't like big government, like what do they mean by that?
Right, exactly right. Yeah.
But I think this also has opened up the possibility for activism that's very effective and interesting. And the last chapter of the book, I write about a guy named Chuck Colson.
Mm-hmm.
And Chuck Colson understood this problem very well. And he himself had gone to prison, had this profound conversion experience. He had worked formerly for Nixon and had gotten involved in some of the various Nixon administration illegalities, had gone to prison, had this remarkable conversion experience to Christianity, and realizes that he wants to do prison ministry work. But during his time in prison, especially, he became fully aware of not only the humanitarian crisis of American prisons, but its soul-sucking bureaucratic qualities that, I think one might associate with like big government. And when you read Colson's early writings, this is how he talks about prisons. He's very keen on describing it as the squelching of individual rights and the squelching of the fire of putting out of the fire of individual creativity and the individual's capability for change by the state. And he starts to organize and do reform work on this premise. by trying to get conservatives, like-minded conservatives, especially evangelicals, involved in prison reform work with the argument that the government should not have the power to do this, that we are robbing individuals of the ability to transform themselves, that we are costing taxpayers like tons of money in all these inefficient ways, how we do all this stuff. And the big problem he has, of course, is that he's arguing against conservatives as well. And he's arguing against fellow evangelicals who are very law and order, who are very anti-crime, and are totally cool with expanding the carceral state or expanding policing or the war on drugs or whatever, and dedicating more tax dollars for that. And so this is the problem Colson has, is he's trying to speak, he's trying to be an apologist, really try to use the assumptions of his brethren to get them to change their mind. And so I think this is even just part of the challenge of understanding where we're at today. We have someone like President Trump, again, who is a law and order president. Like, I personally don't think he's, that interested in transforming the status quo. But at the same time, he still will mobilize and work with criminal justice reformers, usually conservative criminal justice reformers, who are going to talk about the problems of American prisons with reference to it being a big government issue. So I think it's very much a live issue today, but it really causes us to have to refine our terms when we talk about conservative and liberal.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And you brought up Chuck Colson, and he's such a fascinating and important figure for kind of understanding the history of all of this. And you kind of gave his background and kind of what he ended up sort of doing in terms of his own ministry. Can you talk a little bit? This is something that's quite interesting to me. Can you talk a bit about Colson's thinking on the death penalty in particular, and how that kind of changed over time?
So Colson, after he comes out of prison, he's incarcerated in Alabama, in a federal prison there for like 7 or 8 months. And it's a minimum security facility. It's not really, like, as prisons go, probably the worst of the worst at all in any sense, but it's awful for him. And it is truly awful, I think, when you read the stuff that was going on there, not to downplay it. But he soon becomes aware of just all these different problems in criminal justice more generally, as he starts to study the issue, as he starts to get networked with various activists and reform leaders, both sort of all on all sides of the aisle. And the death penalty becomes an early cause for him that he's willing to speak out against. And there's a remarkable moment where he goes to the Southern Baptist Convention in 1979. Southern Baptists at this time are still trying to figure out who they are, but there's this sort of conservative resurgence that's boiling up. And Colson gets on stage and gives his testimony that he's been giving of transformation. And it's very sort of boilerplate evangelical. And it's like, you can tell that he knows his audience. But then he goes off stage to the press room and gives this press conference where he talks about the death penalty and how he's against it. And it was just very remarkable to me to see him. He knows how to speak in one setting. Like, he's not going to talk about being opposed to the death penalty in the big auditorium with all the Southern Baptists, but he'll go to the press room and uses this opportunity to speak out against the death penalty, not because he's a bleeding heart liberal, not because he's, like an abolitionist or anything, but he says simply, I'm a conservative and I don't trust the state to do this kind of thing. And this becomes his position for a few years. This is probably him at his most radical, I guess you could say, like, or outspoken. But then in the mid 80s, he has a really, I think he's becoming more, he's becoming less radical over the course of the 1980s. But there's this transformative moment in the mid 80s where he meets a serial killer, John Wayne Gacy. And he has some correspondence with Gacy back and forth. And there is a remarkable drawing that I found in the archives of a picture of Jesus that Gacy draws Colson. That's a very haunting image. And Colson's clearly interested in trying to help Gacy and trying to convert him. But he's very frustrated because Gacy seems to him to be unrepentant and smug and not really, in Colson's estimation, seems to just be playing games. And later on in his life, Colson recounts this interaction as the moment where he decided, I have to support capital punishment, because people like Gacy, who have committed unspeakable like acts and who are unrepentant, they deserve to die. Like, that is the correct response to this. And he becomes, I wouldn't say like a outspoken advocate for capital punishment throughout the 1990s and 2000s, but he becomes someone that conservatives can point to as a reliable source for why the death penalty should remain in place and why it could be just. You know, here's this guy, he's pro-prison reform, he's compassionate, and even he thinks we should keep executing people. So yeah, I mean, Colson would also say that, you know, like he would say, this doesn't mean that there aren't profound inequalities in how we have done this or how we execute people. Doesn't mean that there aren't bad ways to do this, but he holds out hope that this, you know, could be something we as a society do. And I think this tracks with his broader, I wouldn't want to call it like a punitive turn necessarily, but into the 1990s, he becomes much more of a culture warrior, someone who is very resistant to anything that smells of liberalism and wants to stake out a very conservative political stance against it. And the death penalty becomes a part of that.
Yeah. I mean, this question would be pure speculation, but what do you think Colson would think today, looking at sort of the death penalty if he were still alive? Do you think he would have a different position than than what he sort of shifted to a bit later on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think he would. I mean, he died in 2012.
2012, yeah.
I think he would not think any differently about it. The big question that I had this conversation like a ton of times with people when I was writing the book, both people that knew Colson or worked in some ways with him, was, would Colson have supported Donald Trump? Like, that was like a big, because he's sort of, to me, like this paradigmatic, like respectable, winsome evangelical presence. Right. Like he seems to be, you know, someone that was beloved on all sides of the aisle, like, you know, but at the same time was clear who he was. And that was a debate. I got different answers when I would ask people that question. And some people said, absolutely, he would not. And he would have been aghast at someone like Trump. And then I heard, you know, speculation from other people saying like, yeah, he probably would have been probably begrudgingly, but like, would have. And I think Colson himself would not have, he would have remained, I think, consistent up till the very end. He did in speaking out against the dehumanization of prisoners. Like, he was just clearly, he hated it when politicians would do what he called the Willie Hortonism, you know, of just trotting out like, you know, specters of often racialized caricatures of criminals in order to get votes. And Colson hated that kind of stuff. But Colson was also very much pro law enforcement and was very willing to say, you know, expanded policing and accountability for people who've committed crimes was something we need to have. So, yeah.
So you touched on this a bit earlier about the sort of the racial dimension of what we've been talking about. It seems like many, I don't really like to generalize, but it seems like from where I'm sitting, many evangelicals struggle to grasp the sort of role of systemic racism in general, sort of in society, and with respect to sort of policing and incarceration in particular. But obviously the killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many, many others, I think has done something to the approach of some evangelicals who have been confronted with the horror of these killings more recently. What do you think are the reasons for this historically of this sort of what seems like a general resistance to the idea of systemic racism as impacting policing and incarceration?
I think so. There's been tons of work done on this question. I would certainly recommend people read Christian Smith and Michael Emerson's book Divided by Faith, or work by people like Anthea Butler, who talk about these kinds of things. And I think that it's a debated question for good reason, not only for evangelicals, but just for white Americans more generally. It seems to me that on questions of crime and punishment, on policing, there were two very general responses I saw in the midst of the civil rights movement that were very striking to me from evangelicals. One was a response that labeled civil rights demonstrators as communists, as rabble rousers, as secularists that were trying to destroy America. And this response was, I think, pretty common among a lot of lay people, certainly in the South. And I think that there's a whole host of reasons why evangelicals believe this, but I think there was just this latent racism of suspicion of full inclusion and respect for Black people in the country that was working itself out in this way. And that persists to now. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that kind of stuff is still going on. And we see, especially with resurgent white supremacist actions and violence and leaders and voices, that is very alive. However, there was another option that I think was probably more common, but no less impactful for the carceral state and policing. And that was what I've termed, or I said earlier, was this humanitarian response. Mm-hmm. And so the example I use in the book is this congressman named Jon Anderson, who's a unapologetic evangelical congressman from Illinois, who is named the evangelical of the year in the early 60s at some point, and wears his faith on his sleeve. And early on in his career is pretty opposed to the civil rights movement. But then he has this dramatic transformation in the mid to late 60s where he starts to realize oh, King is right. I've been blind to the plight of Black Americans. I see how racism is a part of, is infecting our churches and our culture in damaging ways. And he actually says, I've had this change of heart in part because of moderate evangelicals like Christianity Today, the magazine, sort of leading me in the right direction. And he becomes a vocal, I think vocal might be a little too strong, but he becomes a supporter of legislation to promote inclusion and civil rights, including the 1968 federal housing bill. But at the same time that Anderson's doing this, and that more moderate evangelicals, white evangelicals, are becoming more amenable to civil rights legislation and inclusion of Black Americans, they are becoming more and more interested in tough on crime and policing and law and order politics. And Anderson himself frames this as a way to protect Black Americans. He says, we have to safeguard America we have to safeguard Black America and safeguard all the Black Americans who do not riot and who do not burn things from this like pervasive, threatening minority.
Yeah, this is what's good for them, right? Yeah.
And this, I think it's this sort of, it's this paternalism. It's this sense that this is a humanitarian project that we can solve these neighborhoods' problems with by sending in more police, by lengthening sentences, by putting up, anti-drug laws or whatever. Like, this is going to help Black America. And as scholars like James Foreman Jr. and others have shown, like, many Black civic leaders and politicians went along with this as well. Like, they were very much interested in these kinds of policies as well. But the effects, the impact, as you might expect, was disproportionately fell on communities of color, poor communities of color, and the colorblind sort of rhetoric that accompanied all this made it intractable, like made it so hard to pull it apart and figure out what the problem was. And it made it very difficult for charges of racism and systemic racism to stick, because people like Anderson, or even on up to today, like people arguing for more law and order, can say, no, I support like civil rights. I support, it doesn't matter to me what color you are or who you are, like, but just don't commit crimes, or, but we're still going to send in the police to your neighborhood more than we do this other neighborhood.
Right.
And I think that that's it. Like that is the story of 20th century criminal justice in a nutshell. Is that aspirations to racial neutrality, color blindness, that then conceal racially conceal sometimes just straight up racism, but then often conceal racially disproportionate outcomes that are, that explains, I think, a lot of why we're at where we are. So.
Yeah, thanks. That's very clear and helpful answer to that. I've got one more question for you, and then I think we have one in the chat that
yeah, sure,
I'll have you address, and then we can.
I'm happy to go like way over time, because I know that I was like gone into the technology. So
you're fine, man. My last question is, your book is a work of history, but I'm wondering if because you gave a practical reason and a kind of a personal reason for why you were interested in this subject to begin with. Are there any ways you hope your work impacts Christians at a sort of local church level, especially evangelicals? Another way to put this would be, what sort do you see any sort of like practical implications resulting from God's law and order and the work that you've put into that?
Yeah, I think one of the things I hope for from my book, and this is where the book, I have an entire chapter on prison ministry in the book, and I haven't really talked about that at all, but sort of the influence of evangelicals in the 1970s and following in prison ministry movements. And I'm pretty optimistic. This maybe we could, I'm sure, deconstruct this a little bit, but I think prison ministry and getting involved in prisons and having a Bible study at a local jail is a great thing that all Christians should be doing and all churches should be doing, like, immediately. Like, pastors should know the inside of their local jail, like the back of their hand. And I think just that act of like going and seeing and meeting people on the inside and becoming, having conversations and learning about them, learning the things they struggle with, learning who they are, their names, writing them letters, bringing their kids presents, like all that kind of stuff. Evangelicals are pretty good at that kind of stuff. Christians are, like, I think pretty good at doing that kind of stuff. And I want to see like way more of it. And because I think it's good in and of itself. I think as a Christian, I would say that there's theological goods inherent to those moments of communion and encounter. But then I think it's also a moment where hopefully imaginations, where people realize that something's wrong. Like where people like, you just go into a prison and see how people are treated, or who's actually there, or how difficult it is to live there. You hear the stories. And I hope that is a catalyzing moment for Christians, for evangelicals, that stems from that just initial ministry experience. And that will push them, push us, push me on to new possibilities, and to imagine, as I say in the book, to imagine a world beyond prisons. And so go, like, this is something I learned from Douglas Campbell, by the way, who was on your show a couple weeks ago, I think. Like, just go to your local prison.
Just visit a prison. Yeah.
Just visit a prison. You're supposed to do it. Jesus says, like,
Jesus does. Matthew Jesus says that. Yeah.
But I think go and, look and listen and hear the voices of the people who are there and learn the context, like, and then over time you'll realize like what you should do.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just to echo that, and I said this during my stream with Douglas as well, was just going into a prison and being confronted with the people there, the whole space and situation and all of that is going to change your life. It really is. And if you feel called to do that by God's Spirit, to enter into those spaces consistently, right? You probably do well to listen to that calling, to be drawn into those spaces, right? Because God's already there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, is like, as we go in, as Christians go in, like, the assumption I think that Christians often have that they need to bring Jesus into these places. And they don't, because Jesus is already there. Like, Jesus is already there in sort of the missiological, like, sort of broader sense, but also literally Jesus is there because there's a lot of Christians who are incarcerated.
There are lots of vibrant Christian communities within Christian within prisons as well, right? So go and like get connected to those communities and to those Christians who are doing the work there. Don't expect to try to don't go in heavy-handed, like go in to listen and go in to hear and ask what they want to say and hear. Exactly. The posture of going in matters so much when you're visiting and when you're in, it's their space. You're stepping into someone else's space, and you need to be respectful when you do so. One question from Ethan, Sport and Theology. Because Aaron read Jesus and John Wayne. It seems to be speaking about similar yet different topics. Were there any connections he made between that book and his?
I have read Jesus and John Wayne. I love that book.
Great?
It's great. Kristen Dumais is someone that whose work I really, really respect, and her voice is so needed right now. I mentioned this actually on social media a couple of days ago. Like, my dream is that someone one day will like write or not one day, hopefully soon, we'll write like a joint review of my book and her book, mainly so that I can leech off of the amazingness that her work is.
But don't sell yourself short, man. Come on.
But I do think that there are some interesting overlaps and differences. And the overlaps, there's sort of just the broader argument that I think or broader conceptual overlap of like, why are things the way they are today with evangelicals? Like Donald Trump, I mean, Dumais' book makes this really striking argument where she says, like, everyone's like, where did Donald Trump come from? Like, how can this like philandering, you know, awful dude like get all this evangelical support when theoretically they've been, you know, all about purity and all about virtue this whole time.
Right,
And Dumais shows that like actually Donald Trump is exactly what you should expect. And I think that's a very compelling, I think she does a great job supporting that. My argument is the same in form, in that I show how, yes, you should have expected like someone like Donald Trump. And I end the book with Donald Trump because I say his law and order posturing, at the same time, he's also arguing for criminal justice reform and like trotting out examples of changed hearts of prisoners in his campaign stuff. That's exactly what has been going on throughout the 20th century. However, I think, and maybe Professor Dumais would push back against what I'm about to say. I would love to have this debate, or others who've read the book, but I think that there is a, in my book, more of a sense of how consensus drives what evangelicals are doing. And I think the way I would maybe put it is, as evangelicals are becoming law and order, as they are imbibing the norms and assumptions of the carceral state and helping to create it itself, they're actually just becoming Americans. Like they're just becoming good American citizens. And they are, and I think that this is, that it's that broader sense there that maybe differentiates my work from Professor Dumais, in that I see, mine is talking more directly about these moderate white evangelicals who are intentionally trying to be as centrist as they can, and who are not, who see everything that they do as part of the norm of adapting to like what normal political life looks like. So that might, I would be interested to hear others' thoughts on this question. But Jesus and John Wayne's fantastic. And I think the punitive dimension, just the fact that John Wayne is so often portrayed as the sheriff character, is very illuminating and very much what I'm talking about in mine.
That's right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe I've been actually wanting Professor Dumais on the show at some point. Maybe at some point we could have both of you on for a discussion.
That'd be fun.
Yeah. And hopefully at that point, Laura will be, you know, she's just got a dissertation to write. She's not busy at all right now. So, but I know that she would be very much interested in that discussion too. She's a huge fan of your work and also Professor Dumais' work as well. But Aaron, thank you so much for doing this.
Sure.
I really appreciate it.
I'm happy to take any more questions if people
let me look through. I don't know if we have any more.
I was also going to say that if people want to, if you read the book or you're interested in the book, like reach out to me on Twitter or reach out to me on my website, aaronlgriffith.com. There's a contact link there, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about the book. I'd love to answer questions. And if you have like a church group or a class, or even just you're reading it and you want to chat about it, I love doing that. So reach out.
Yeah. I've got your Twitter info in the description, but I can put your website down there as well. And I've also got a link to the book there so people can buy it, which you should. You should all go buy this book immediately because it's great.
Thank you.
So thank you, Aaron, again for doing this. And with that, this has been Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With. Thanks, everyone.